Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss how the opposite day Brexit Brigade are highlighting the arrest of the Vice President of the European Parliament as evidence that the EU is corrupt, when if anything, it shows that it's resistant to corruption. You know, they're also very quiet about the lack of law enforcement involvement in our own proven corruption. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So one of the arguments Brexiteers levelled at the EU, as well as the fact it's going to collapse next Thursday, is the idea that it is corrupt. Now, I would argue the opposite. Corruption exists, of course, amongst politicians everywhere, all over the world. There will always be self-serving people motivated to seek high office, which means you will always get some self-serving people elected to high office. And there will always be wealthy people who will attempt to subvert them, corrupt them, in order to push their own agenda. The risks are obvious, but it's way easier to corrupt an individual government, especially such a centralised one as exists in the UK, than the EU. And this is because there are so many branches to power in the EU, so many individuals controlling the levers of power, that the idea of corrupting the system, the governance, would be daunting for someone attempting to try. With the UK as an example, however, all someone has to do is corrupt the leadership of the party in government. That's it. Rupert Murdoch is reported to have said when he was asked about why he was opposed to the EU, "That's easy. When I go into Downing Street, they do what I say. When I go to Brussels, they take no notice." Now, like quotes of this kind, I don't know if it's true or not, but you can see the wisdom in it. If anyone can just get to our head of government, or even a senior member of our cabinet, then the level of power centralised in the hands of a small number of people makes it easier for a malign influence to get their way. But where do you start with the EU? If you did it as a thought exercise, if you wanted to corrupt the EU, where do you start? The EU Commission itself has commissioners from all member states. And although there is a president, they can easily be removed if the others thought they were up to no good. And it's not like the UK Cabinet, where they'll all cover for each other. Because in the UK Cabinet, they're all members of the same political party. Their political fortunes are all tied to each other. So even if one of their colleagues lets the side down and they're not happy, for the greater good they'll cover for them to avoid besmirching the reputation of their entire political group. But the commission's really hard to corrupt. You've got individual commissioners from different countries, all representing different political groups, different political parties. So it's really hard to corrupt because you'd have to nobble loads of them, not just one or two. The EU Council is largely just the leaders of each member state, prime ministers and presidents. Again, people can try and get to them, but to corrupt the wider EU, you need to get to a lot of them. Then the Parliament. No single political party holds majority parliamentary power, as is the case in the UK and sometimes other countries as well. So the only way to corrupt the whole EU Parliament is to get at a lot of powerful leaders. And it's not that corruption is impossible, as we've seen from the raids and arrests in the last week. It's just that it is incredibly difficult. You know, and this is for two main reasons. First, no one person has that much power. This means that for a corrupt person to get what they want done, they need to bribe or blackmail or otherwise convince a lot of people. Second, if anyone in the organisation sees evidence of corruption, they're much less likely to ignore it or help cover it up. Why would they? You know, if you look at Westminster, for example, there's a majority of Tory MPs. Well, they act in their own common interest. Doesn't matter how much an opposition MP can find proof of corruption. Nothing happens if the party in power closes ranks. As for the government, every single one of them are in the same party and all chosen by a single person, the Prime Minister. Every single one. You know, this simply doesn't happen in the EU. It's far more robust to the threat of corruption. And far from these raids and arrests proving that the EU is corrupt, because people go, "Oh, Phil, what about the arrests? Does that prove it?" No, it actually proves that it's very resistant to that corruption. This investigation and the arrests occurred because there was motivation to others within the organisation to expose it, not to cover it up. What we're actually seeing is not EU corruption. We're seeing corruption amongst a small number of people in the EU, but law enforcement is able to carry out its investigations without hindrance, can carry out its raids, can carry out its arrests, zero attempt by their political masters to obstruct them. What we're seeing is justice in action. Even a very senior member of the EU Parliament, this is the Vice President, cannot expect to be above the law. Shall we now compare the situation with the UK? See, let's look at a few proven examples of corruption, shall we? When I say proven, I mean proven. I mean that either a British court has verified that the law had been broken or that a parliamentary committee has said so. So let's start with the Brexit campaign. The Vote Leave campaign, headed up by numerous MPs, including Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, were found to have broken the law. This was before the government removed the independence of the Electoral Commission who investigated. That is in itself an act of corruption. It's an attempt to stop themselves being investigated. Now, there should have been a National Crime Agency investigation into whether any individuals had broken criminal laws. Once it's determined that an organisation has broken the law, you have to then look at, so did any individuals break criminal law? The investigation never took place because the Prime Minister at the time, Theresa May, threatened the funding of the National Crime Agency. Now, May will have had no time for the individuals involved. I'm sure she didn't really like them. She was no Brexiteer either, so she wasn't covering for the organisation. So why did she intervene to stop law enforcement acting? As I said earlier, because the Tories are all in it together. And they are motivated to cover for each other in order to protect the reputation of their party. It's not just Conservatives who do this. Political organisations will do this in general. They will convince themselves it's for the greater good that they cover up some untoward behaviour from someone in their organisation rather than let the whole organisation look tatty, corrupt. So then we could look at Russian interference. So a parliamentary committee, including Tory MPs, concluded that the only reason our intelligence services had not found evidence of the Kremlin interfering in our elections, in our political processes, is because the government, again under Theresa May, ordered them not to look. It was an absolute scandal when that was announced, because our government specifically told our intelligence services, do not look for evidence of Russian interference in our politics. Now, this was a very big deal. And Boris Johnson attempted unsuccessfully to have the report buried forever so that we would never see any of its findings. More corruption that can only exist when all of the levers of power are held by people whose destinies are linked together. Couldn't happen if power is shared amongst different political groups. Can't possibly happen. Because another political group will say, well, we're not interested in covering for you, you're our opponents. Then we could look at furlough or PPE fraud. The High Court confirmed that the VIP lane, the way the government awarded PPE contracts, for example, was a breach of the law. Again, no investigation by law enforcement. Why is the only investigation going on into any aspect of it a single fraudster, Michelle Mone? And how come even that investigation is taking so long? Because although corruption exists everywhere, the obstacles for law enforcement in the UK are severe because political power is concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of people, all of whom consider themselves to be all in it together, as thick as thieves. They will cover for each other in order to protect the reputation of the party, even if they are personally appalled by the abuse. We know that there are Tory MPs, for example, who were aghast at the idea that Russia could be interfering in our politics and that we were doing nothing. Appalled that Boris Johnson slipped his security detail to go and attend a drunken party with Russian agents after the Russian state had just carried out an attack on British soil. None too impressed with one of those Russian oligarchs being pushed into the House of Lords against the advice of the Appointments Committee and intelligence services. There are Tory MPs who see the corruption in their midst and they do not like it one little bit. But they don't do anything about it, do they? And why? Because they consider that trying to protect the reputation of their party is for some greater good. Arresting politicians is not proof that a political system is corrupt. It is evidence that that corruption is not tolerated in that system. When it comes to corrupt political systems, look at where investigations are blocked. Look at where arrests are not made, other than maybe a few scapegoats when it gets really bad. That is a sign of a corrupt political system. And it's not a UK specific issue. You know, it can happen much more easily in any national government than it can the EU. The closer you get to a political system where power is concentrated in a small number of hands, where they are all part of the same clique, the same political group, the more likely corruption is to occur. Because for someone to want to corrupt them with bribery or blackmail, you only have to get at a very small number of people, maybe even just one person. You know, and in a system like that, they're less likely to deal with it. Conversely, the more spread that power is amongst more politicians representing more political groups, the more resistant that system is to corruption, because they're less likely to want to cover for each other. You know, I draw attention to the unchecked corruption in the UK, mostly because I'm more familiar with it. It's my country. But corruption is everywhere. It's everywhere where there's power. And it's really a case of what checks you have against that corruption. The EU have a large hierarchy of people who don't always see a common interest in covering up corruption. A national government with power centralised in a single political party is much more vulnerable. In fact, one of my objections to Brexit was that it would, and indeed did, further centralise power into the hands of a small group of people whose close affiliations with one another would encourage them to cover for corruption within their ranks. Brexit made us much more vulnerable to corruption, and we can see the effects. Where are the arrests in the UK? We see justice in Belgium taking place. We see raids, we see arrests. Why aren't we seeing it here? But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.